these are molecules that come from plants, that come from fungi, that come in some cases from animals, that act on the same pathways that are endogenous or that already exist within our bodies that are activated by other things. Things like exercise, like nutrition, like fasting. Molecules, when given to the right people at the right time, have been correlated with substantial quality of life improvement that lasts not months, but years. We live in a world where we want our politicians to have ideas that they stick to for decades. We literally call them out when they, quote, flip flop, which is literally changing your mind. And I think if there's anything that's clear to me is that open-mindedness and changing our minds is exactly what we need. And so looking at the things that are on the market, not on the market, every intervention on earth, what are the things that allow people to become more open-minded? There are a few things that appear to be more potent than psychedelics.
Welcome to the Psychedelic Diaries. I am Ray Krishan, and we have a delightful show for you today. We'll be discussing psychedelic neuroscience, talking fungi, and pattern breaking. Dr. Austin Perlmutter, a New York Times Bestselling MD and author, will be here for a deep dive and a soul search. But as usual, let's kick things off with a nugget and a noodle. And for today's news nugget, Magic Mushrooms Group Chat. Researchers have found the communication of 4 species of fungi had electrical impulses that were structurally similar to human speech and resembled vocabulary of dozens of words. So perhaps someday we'll be able to slide in the mushroom DM. And as for the noodle, something I've been noodling on of late, an age limit for psychedelics. High doses of psychedelics can reboot the way you see the world. And that's great for those that need a refresh, for those that have way too many tabs open on their mental Chrome browser. But maybe not so good for those still constructing their reality. Neuroscience has indicated that the brain is still forming through the age of 26. And anecdotally, for many of us, myself included, you finally start to see the matrix a lot more clearly in your 30s. So perhaps it's best to let children, teenagers, and even young adults continue to form their neural paths before those paths get reset with high doses of psychedelics. Part of the wonder and awe of high doses is they show you a meta view of your construct of reality. And if you're still in the nascent stages of creating that construct, maybe high doses aren't appropriate. So what does that mean? Well, maybe an age limit of 30 for high doses of psilocybin. Plus, there's something magical about the anticipation of turning 21 and finally being able to buy a drink. Imagine a world where you finally turn 30 and you get to legally purchase your first large dose of psilocybin. Something to noodle on. Our next guest is a physician, a New York Times Bestselling author, and host of the Get the Stuck Out podcast. Dr. Austin Perlmutter, welcome to the show.
Ray, I'm thrilled to be here today. What a great thing to be able to talk about this stuff. So thanks for having me.
Appreciate that. You're one of my favorites. I'm also excited for this. Let's dive right in, Austin. So I loved your explanation of neuroplasticity at the neuron level as it relates to psychedelics. I'm probably going to butcher this, but you talked about this concept that psychedelics may be activating glutamate, and that then instructs the neurons in your brain to strengthen or refresh the connections with other neurons, perhaps ones they haven't been communicating with in a while. As you dove deep, Austin, into this world of psychedelics, neuroscience, what has surprised you?
Well, Ray, I think so much of this is surprising. You know, when I grew up, and really, I think still the conversation around this is that just psychedelics are drugs. Drugs are bad. Specifically, they're drugs of abuse. And this is consistent with the idea that most of these are Schedule 1. I mean, they really are in the United States. And so they can't have any positive benefit, right? They are just drugs of abuse. But what the neuroscience would show is that these are molecules that come from plants, that come from fungi, that come in some cases from animals, that act on the same pathways that are endogenous or that already exist within our bodies that are activated by other things. Things like exercise, like nutrition, like fasting. So, when it comes to what psychedelics do in the brain, I will be clear we're still learning a lot, and there's tons of ongoing research. But what seems to be the case is that psychedelic molecules, specifically classic psychedelic molecules, bind to a receptor called the serotonin 2A receptor. And when they do that, they trigger a variety of different pathways. One of those pathways actually activates what's called neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity is the idea, this fundamentally important idea that our brains are always rewiring. So, really important to understand this. People have this idea that your brain is what it is from one day to the next, but it really isn't. The brain is always changing. And so certain things that we do can augment that change in a positive or negative way. So, for example, stress changes the brain, but it changes it in such a way that it gets more stuck into certain patterns that are bad for our mental health. On the other hand, what psychedelics appear to do is open up some of this change in a positive way. So you brought up a molecule called glutamate, which is kind of a neurotransmitter. It augments neurotransmission. And research has shown that that is a key modulator or changer of the strength of how neurons are connected. And so psychedelics appear to act on this molecule. They change its signaling, and that's probably one of the key ways in which psychedelics are able to change the brain.
That's fascinating. I appreciate that inside scoop. It feels like for a lot of people that go through it anecdotally, where you feel like you're different. You feel like maybe you're more in control of your emotions, maybe a little bit more creative, maybe a little bit more cognitive ability. But it's obviously we can't see what's going on in the brain, and most doctors and scientists for the longest time haven't been able to. And yet now it seems like we're starting to catch up. We're starting to kind of prove out some of this anecdotal evidence around psychedelics. So that's fascinating. And I think you kind of already have shown it, Austin, but you really strike me as a paragon of this new wave of doctors that are well informed, bold, and eager to blaze new paths in neuroscience, perhaps even psychedelics. And I love the podcast name. You talk a lot about getting unstuck. And yet it's so easy for people to get stuck in their behavioral loops, their routines. Austin, why do you think it's so hard for people to change?
Well, to begin, I want just people to understand that change is the default. There's really no opting out of that. We are always changing our cells, our brains. At any given moment, there is change happening. And how do you know this? Well, you know things today that you didn't know yesterday. You are literally a different person today than you were yesterday. But within this, I think it is clear that we do become more rigid in certain ways, and that would be the stuckness. And so, how does that stuckness occur? My work has primarily been on understanding how the brain gets stuck. And so, stuckness can be a reflection of certain receptors. We talked about glutamate. It can be a reflection of currents within the brain and kind of the strength of connections between neurons. It can be a reflection of the networks of neurons. So, great example of this, people may have heard of the default mode network. It's kind of an interconnected series of hubs in the brain, and they communicate. And it's been shown that too much activation and connectivity within the default mode network may be linked to worse mental health. And on the other hand, psychedelics may help to kind of uncouple that, get stuckness out by, in essence, opening up some of those channels that are otherwise locked in. You can also think about areas of the brain like the prefrontal cortex, located right here, involved in emotion processing, involved in higher level thinking, and its connection to a part of the brain called the limbic system. Again, emotional processing, and how that connection seems to suffer in people who have certain conditions, especially stress based conditions, but also depression. And so it gets stuck in patterns where it's not communicating in a good way. So there are all these ways in which we can kind of look at our biology, specifically our brain biology, and talk about how it gets locked into patterns that are stuck, that are rigid, that are unhelpful for our mental health. And the reasons for this, there are many, but the one that I think is most important to understand is I think about the analogy of the fish swimming in the polluted river, and that's where we are right now as it relates to our brain health. If you look at the inputs, whether it's the food or the relationships, the content that we consume, the nature we are not getting exposure to, this is an environment that promotes stuckness, promotes poor mental health, it promotes poor physical health. So if you're asking, why do I think this is the case right now, that despite in theory access to all of the things that are supposed to make us happy, do we have so many people across the planet suffering from conditions like depression and anxiety? I think it's because the inputs are largely those that promote stuckness. And what that means is, number one, we have to understand it. And number two, we have to make changes to those inputs because we are fundamentally a reflection of our inputs. If those inputs are good, we tend to have better health. If those inputs are bad, if they're low quality, our health, including our mental health, tends to suffer.
Reflection of our inputs. I love that. And this water analogy reminded me of an old parable where two young fish are swimming along the sea. They bump into an older fish and he says, "Hey, morning, boys. How's the water?" And then swims off. And then one of the other small fishes, young fishes, turns to the other and says, "What's water?" And I think that is apropos to the way we see the world. And to your point, if that water is murky and dirty, it's even harder to really see what you're doing and what your meta inputs are and what your life is doing, and what your life is like and how you can change it. Austin, I love this concept of change at the cognitive level. Really quick, as an aside, speaking of change, I know you are a mushroom forager when we talked last time. For someone that's interested in getting into that and wants that change in their life, what's a low hanging fruit to get started in mushroom foraging?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it so the specific type of mushroom is going to depend on where you live, right? Because they're kind of regional depending on northern or southern climates. So I live in the Pacific Northwest. I live outside of Seattle right now, and that means we have a whole bunch of different edible mushrooms. Fall is a
Hmm.
big season for it. So we have porcinis, which are kind of active right now. Morel mushrooms, which are again active right now. It's the springtime. Fall is for chanterelles. We have lobster mushrooms in the summer. Point being, though, there's lots of opportunities. You just have to know what to look for. I mean, I think that's a good, probably, metaphor for life. However, with any sort of wild mushroom foraging, I highly recommend you go with somebody who knows what they're doing the first time
Hmm.
because it can be dangerous. And again, I think there's a lot of metaphor, a lot of analogy here, but some of those guys are toxic. And so I've gone with a guide, kind of a mycology interested guide several times who has walked us through the places that you tend to find the right types of mushrooms. What's super interesting about this, when we talk about kind of the importance of community as humans, mushrooms are a perfect example. So mushrooms have these relationships with the plants that live around them. They have these mycelial networks that communicate with trees. There's bidirectional sharing of information and nutrients. And so, for example, chanterelle mushrooms, which are delicious, popular mushroom here in the fall, have a relationship with Doug fir trees. So you need to look for Doug firs because they communicate. And you can't grow chanterelles in a home. You can't grow them in some sort of captivity. They have to be in these large scale networks to thrive.
Hmm.
Similar to, in many ways, I think humans, right? The idea that you can have interpersonal relationships purely online just doesn't seem to really fit with the way that we are wired. So, for people interested, highly recommend that you check out maybe going with a local guide, somebody with an expertise in mycology, because you can mess up. But I will tell you the wonder that comes from being out on your own and finding mushrooms and being able to eat them and see where they live. It is stunning.
I love that. Yeah, go get a guide, try that. I started growing my own mushrooms and just had a lion's mane batch come through. We don't have a lot of natural mushrooms growing out in the wild and lush forests here in LA like you do. And yet, even just growing my own lion's mane, it was just a very satisfying experience. And then to consume something that I had grown was really satisfying. So I appreciate that take. And another take of yours that I love is that, Austin, you talk a lot about mental health but also improved cognitive abilities. And I've personally seen the dramatic impact that psychedelics can have on cognitive abilities. And yet, the medical community still prefers hard evidence, let's say biomarkers. While we are in this space of mental health that is still somewhat opaque, how would you approach trying to prove that psychedelics can improve cognitive ability?
It's a great question. And I'll just put out the important kind of background, which is proving causality, which is what we're trying to do, saying that one thing leads to another thing is incredibly difficult. And in the realm of medicine, there are very, very few things for which there's proven causality. A bunch of different criteria need to be kind of carefully constructed and tested. As it relates to cognition, there are kind of a host of different ways that you can examine what it means to have better cognition. So, in some people's way of looking at it, it would be standardized tests of memory, of ability to react to test questions and at quick speed. Um, as it stands, I think there are very few things that anyone would say are proven to improve cognition. Now, some people, myself included, would say there are areas where there's good enough evidence that I'm willing to put my claim on it. Things like exercise, things like eating a healthy diet. And the reason is exercise, people who exercise tend to have much lower rates of something like dementia.
Hmm.
People who eat a healthier diet tend to have lower rates of dementia as well. People who get good sleep. But what is fascinating to me about psychedelics is you're starting to look at different dimensions of cognition. So, in the short term, memory, so trying to kind of do tests of memory, is lowered in people who acutely use classic psychedelics or classical psychedelics like psilocybin. However, autobiographical memory improves. And this has been shown in a recent study, it was published last year, did an analysis of other studies. And so a person has an easier time bringing up memories of what happened to them in the past. So being able to think through that was what it was like to be in that place at that time with those people. On the other hand, taking the SAT, probably not a great plan. What's even more interesting to me, though, is other dimensions of cognition like creativity. And so you alluded to this, and creativity does appear to increase as a reflection of using these molecules. And then even deeper for me is open-mindedness. So
Hmm.
that is a kind of version of cognition that isn't always seen as a positive, right? I mean, we live in a world where we want our politicians to have ideas that they stick to for decades. We literally call them
Hmm.
out when they quote flip-flop, which is literally changing your mind. And I think if there's anything that's clear to me is that open-mindedness and changing our minds is exactly what we need. And so looking at the things that are on the market, not on the market, every intervention on earth, what are the things that allow people to become more open-minded? There are a few things that appear to be more potent than psychedelics. So again, to kind of come back to the question, psychedelics appear to have significant effects on cognition. That's obvious. If you have tripped yourself, if you have worked with people who have had trips, cognition is changed. It impairs
Hmm.
cognition in some ways, it augments and improves cognition in other ways. And I think really what we need to look for is what are the aspects that we care about? In this case, I think open mindedness, creativity, autobiographical memory. These are the areas where there seems to be the best evidence. And these are also areas where I think some people really benefit from having that augmented cognition.
I love this idea of dementia as perhaps kind of have to extrapolate backwards a little bit to healthy adults, but this idea of dementia as perhaps a canary in the coal mine to teach us some of try to suss out the causation correlation challenge. And also like how you talked about this idea of politicians with change and how we criticize them for change made me think of how Obama, he changed his tune on gay rights. And that was one of the really commendable things I think he ever did. And I think change is a good thing. And the idea of creativity as something that gets enhanced, I sometimes wonder if it's a proxy in a way for what psychedelics can do, which is in a way make you more childlike. And
Hmm.
children have a sense of wonder. Their brains are like a lantern to the world, whereas adults are kind of like a flashlight, sometimes a little bit limited. And this idea that, you know, yeah, you're a little bit, you feel younger, you seem like a little bit more childlike, which can mean more creativity, which is beautiful. But sometimes being childlike ain't the thing. If you're in a hard hitting
Hmm.
meeting, a hard hitting negotiation, sometimes you don't want to be creative and childlike. You want to be adult and firm and strong. So I appreciate that it's not all roses with psychedelics. There are some costs, as you mentioned. So, speaking of which, I think you're one of the very articulate uh, and well-informed doctors in this space. So thank you for what you're doing, Austin. I think it's important
Appreciate it.
to have guys like you that have a sense of objectivity and a sense of curiosity and deep intellect and the ability to speak extemporaneously about this topic with aplomb. So thank you for what you're doing. You are in a relatively small fraternity of guys of MDs that are outspoken on this topic. What has drawn you originally to speak about this?
Yeah. Um, so to your point, it is definitely the case that I think most conventional doctors might be interested, but that interest is either show me the peer-reviewed research or potentially they'll do it in their own lives and just never talk about it because it's considered something that would be unfitting for a professional. My interest in this stems from, I guess, two things. One is my fascination with nature and what nature can do for us. But the big one is mental health. And I wrote about this in Brainwash, the book we put out a couple of years ago. Just in that there were a few things that were clear to me in my medical training, then that mental health was poor. And it was poor in my patients and it was poor in my colleagues. And I was seeing so many people getting put on antidepressants, anti-anxiolytics. Again, not just my patients, but my friends. And realized that in myself, my mental health wasn't good. And
Hmm.
the idea that we have our health professionals, our doctors, um, suffering from depression, anxiety, and suicide at a higher rate than the general population, that our healers need so much mental health healing, really stuck with me. And I just decided that I needed to understand better what was going on that was leading to these outcomes. And so that led me down a path of trying to see what it was that I had missed in my medical training. I mean, I learned about mechanisms of actions and prescribed antidepressants, antipsychotics, sometimes anti anxiety medications. But from a root cause analysis, I don't think that was ever sufficient, right? So, one of the things I talk about a lot is that we look at depression. Many people look at depression as a serotonin deficiency, and yet our conventional antidepressant medications, specifically SSRIs, which are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, don't work for a lot of people, meaning around 33% or a third of people, despite using all the therapies, won't really get significant remission. Uh, and that rates of side effects are, 30 to 50%. Rates of withdrawal effects are 50%. When you take a person off an antidepressant medication, it's not like it necessarily fixed the problem, it just potentially masked it. So there had to be better things, or there had to be more things available. So that led me to try to understand what was happening in the brain. What is the kind of neurobiological basis of depression? Um, and there you start to get to these pathways that we've talked about a little bit already. So yes, serotonin is involved, but so are stress pathways. So is the immune system. So is the metabolic pathways. And then I had some friends who were starting to get into psychedelics, both for their own benefit as well as for their own interest in it. And I, being the MD, was skeptical because of the concerns that I think many people have, which is these are incredibly dangerous molecules. They're drugs of abuse. But when I went to the literature, when I went to the peer-reviewed literature that now we see in journals like JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, the New England Journal of Medicine, so basically the top-tier medical journals in the world, what I saw is that these were medications that, in the right subset of people, had incredibly powerful and beneficial effects on mental health, and that in those same populations had incredibly low rates of side effects.
Hmm.
And that in these populations, I had the opportunity to speak with Anthony Bossis recently, who is one of the NYU researchers who published the kind of initial frame shifting work on psilocybin for end of life distress. That these molecules, when given to the right people at the right time, have been correlated with substantial quality of life improvement that lasts not months, but years. And so it all came together for me in this picture, which is, why are we not looking at these molecules? Why are we not at least considering how we can leverage this in the right populations? And what kept me with it is, of course, my interest in my own mental health and trying to better understand the dynamic. But is the recognition that here we are in the modern world, 2022, we have 300 plus million people suffering from depression. We have, based on the latest research from the Lancet, increased rates of depression, anxiety, stress. We're talking about 28% of people experiencing depression, 27% of people with anxiety, 50% with psychological distress, and certainly all worsened because of the pandemic. And our solutions that we have right now are just not enough. And that's the bottom line. There are people for whom conventional medicines are the necessary next step, but there are many, many people who need something more. And I just think, if you were to kind of look at the expanse of knowledge, what we have about all of our therapeutics, I don't see how you can discount psychedelics at this stage. So I think they're interesting for a number of reasons, but we desperately need better solutions. And the evidence to date suggests that there's no way we can, or at least I can feel good about ignoring what we've seen so far.
That's fantastic. Uh, Austin, you are one of the leaders at the tip of the spear on this. That was a great deep dive. Thank you for those takes. We got to transition over to the speed round soul search. So, Austin, you are on a desert island for 10 years, and you only get to bring one movie and one musical artist with you. Who you got?
It's a good combo. I thought you were going to go with the book. So a musical artist would be Tom York. I just think he has enough creativity and variability in what he can produce to keep me fascinated. Um, One movie is tougher. So I mean, my favorite movie, this isn't some sort of a complex cultural film, is Interstellar, because I think it just opens up all of the possibilities where I could have my connection to humanity sustained over a longer period of time, but still have a piqued interest in understanding the world around me, with the expectation that there is more to this picture than meets the eye.
I love that. It's also one of my favorite movies. Okay, Austin, question number two. You're a entrepreneurial MD, and so you're familiar with starting up new projects and concepts. Let's say you're starting up a new business opportunity. Would you rather have a business partner that talks too much or too little?
Too little, for sure. Provided that so number one is, does the person know what they're talking about? Generally speaking, less talking, more reflecting are the people that I tend to gravitate towards.
I'm with you on that one. Okay, question number three, Austin. Let's wave a magic wand. Psychedelic medicine is legal, respectful and intentional use is the norm, and then 5 to 10 years pass by. How is that world different?
Well, ideally, rates of mental health conditions that are poorly treated are lower. Fundamentally, people are more content, are more satisfied, and I think more connected. Um, I think it all comes down to the connection piece. So it's an internal connection with ourselves, and it's an external connection with the people around us. I think, if anything, psychedelics have consistently been shown to help connect people to themselves, to nature, and to the people around them. So I imagine that would be a world in which people care more about the environment, people care more about looking out for each other, so higher levels of interpersonal empathy, and people care more about themselves.
I like that idea, and I like this concept of connection. Speaking of which, that dovetails well into our fourth question, Austin, and final question. Who is one person that has had a dramatic impact on your career?
I default to my dad on this one. Um, I think he's the best example. He is a neurologist. He has consistently made choices that were out of sync with what mainstream medicine was doing, and has, I think, had an outsized effect, positive effect on the lives of so many people, because he was willing to do his own discovery and put those findings out in the public eye. And the last thing on that is, um, he's a very well-known author. He has several books that are very famous, including Grain Brain. But what people don't necessarily realize is he wrote a ton of books before that. And I think the idea of being successful as a reflection of shots on goal and perseverance is really powerful. And so he's a great example of that for me.
Oh, that's cool. I'm sure that would warm his heart if he had a chance to hear that. Okay, Austin, that was a lovely speed round. Thank you for that. He is the author of Brainwash, New York Times bestselling author. The podcast is Get the Stuck Out. Go check out the book, check out the podcast. Austin, in your own words, where can the viewers find you?
I think the easiest spots are Instagram. It's Austin Perlmutter, my name. And then my website is austinperlmutter.com. So if you're interested, I have a newsletter there. I send out my musings, scientific updates. So those are probably the best spots.
Wonderful. He is Dr. Austin Perlmutter. Austin, thank you for joining the show.
Thanks for having me, Ray.
Okay, next week, Guy Borgford from McKenna Academy and Mycology Sciences will be joining us. Thank you to Austin Perlmutter for joining the show, and thank you for watching this episode of Psychedelic Diaries. I'm Ray Christian. See you next time.